In June 2021, a fatal shooting occurred on John Deere Road in Jefferson County, Indiana, that would expose not just the violence within motorcycle club culture, but also the profound failures of modern journalism to accurately report these complex stories. The case involved multiple motorcycle club members, resulted in 1 death, led to 5 arrests, and culminated in a conviction carrying between 90 and 130 years in prison. Yet despite extensive media coverage spanning from the initial incident to the final conviction in early 2023, fundamental questions about what actually happened remain unclear to the public. Was the victim a member of the Pagan's motorcycle club or the Warlocks motorcycle club? Which specific Warlocks chapter was involved, given that multiple organizations use that name? Why do different news reports contradict each other on basic facts? This confusion isn't accidental or unavoidable. It represents a systematic failure in how media covers motorcycle club crime, prioritizing sensational headlines over accurate reporting and leaving communities confused about the actual threats they face. This documentary examines not just the Indiana shooting case, but the broader problems with how motorcycle club violence gets reported, investigated, and prosecuted. We'll analyze the actual court documents and arrest reports to understand what really happened, explore why news coverage was so contradictory and unclear, examine the legal strategies prosecutors use in these cases, including the increasingly common charge of being a member of a criminal organization, and discuss what this case reveals about ongoing conflicts within motorcycle club culture. The story that emerges is more complex and troubling than any individual news report suggested, revealing failures at multiple levels of our justice and information systems. The case itself is straightforward in its tragic outcome, but complicated in its details. On June 22, 2021, around 4 in the morning, Dustin Linder, age 35 from Georgetown, Kentucky, was fatally shot on John Deere Road in DuPont, Indiana. 5 individuals were arrested and charged with his murder, including Michael Carno, who was identified as the president of a Warlocks chapter called the Heavy Hitters. By early 2023, Carno had been convicted of murder, attempted burglary while armed, attempted robbery while armed, obstruction of justice, and being a member of a criminal organization while committing these offenses. His sentence of 90 to 130 years effectively means life imprisonment. But the path from incident to conviction is filled with contradictions, unclear reporting, and questions that mainstream media never adequately answered. The incident and the confusion. According to court documents and prosecutor statements, the incident began with a dispute over motorcycle club patches and tattoos. Michael Carno, identified as president of the Warlocks Heavy Hitters chapter, had encountered a man at a gas station in North Vernon, Indiana, who was wearing patches and displaying tattoos associated with motorcycle clubs. Carno believed these patches and tattoos were unauthorized, that the man was falsely claiming membership in clubs or displaying symbols he had no right to wear. In motorcycle club culture, wearing unauthorized patches or claiming false affiliation is considered one of the most serious forms of disrespect, often met with violent consequences. The patches aren't just decoration, but represent earned status, years of loyalty and membership in organizations with strict entry requirements. Someone wearing patches they didn't earn is viewed as stolen valor, disrespecting everyone who legitimately earned their colors. Rather than confronting the man immediately or simply reporting the matter to other club members, Carno took the matter seriously enough to travel to Philadelphia to gather information about this individual. This detail, mentioned in prosecutor statements but underreported in media coverage, reveals the sophistication and interstate nature of motorcycle club networks. Carno could travel to Philadelphia, presumably to consult with Warlock's leadership or members with access to membership records, to verify whether this individual was legitimately affiliated with any recognized club. The fact that he made this trip demonstrates that motorcycle clubs maintain detailed membership records and communication networks across state lines, operating much like legitimate national organizations with verification systems and hierarchies that span the country. After returning from Philadelphia, Carno organized what prosecutors described as a planned confrontation. Multiple gang members, later identified as fellow Warlocks members, met at Carno's house to plan their approach. They were armed with handguns, knives, and handcuffs, suggesting they intended not just to confront, but to restrain and possibly assault the target. The group made multiple trips to John Deere Road, apparently conducting surveillance or waiting for the right moment to execute their plan. This level of planning would later support the prosecution's charges of conspiracy and demonstrate that the shooting wasn't a spontaneous altercation, but a premeditated attack. In the early morning hours of June 22nd, the confrontation occurred on John Deere Road. Details of exactly what happened during those moments remain unclear from public reporting, but the outcome was tragic and clear. Dustin Linder was shot and fatally wounded. He died from his injuries, and 5 individuals, including Carno, were arrested and charged with his murder. The initial arrests were covered by local media, with headlines emphasizing biker gang members in deadly shootout, language that sensationalized the incident while providing little substantive information about what actually occurred or why. Here's where the confusion that frustrated commentators and the public began. Initial news reports identified Dustin Linder as a member of the Pagan's Motorcycle Club, a major outlaw motorcycle club with chapters primarily on the East Coast and expanding westward. The Pagans are one of the so-called Big Four outlaw motorcycle clubs in America, along with the Hells Angels, Outlaws, and Bandidos, known for their size, organization, and involvement in criminal activity. If Linder was a pagan, the shooting would represent a significant escalation in conflict between the Pagans and Warlocks, 2 clubs with documented history of violent rivalry. This would be major news within motorcycle club culture and potentially signal the beginning of a wider war between organizations with thousands of members across multiple states. However, subsequent reporting became muddled and contradictory. Some articles stated that Linder was a Pagan member. Others suggested he was a Warlocks member or former member. Still other reports indicated that the confrontation occurred because Linder was wearing patches or displaying tattoos from both clubs or from clubs he wasn't actually a member of. Prosecutor statements mentioned that Carno and his associates confronted someone displaying patches and tattoos of those clubs, using plural language that suggested multiple club affiliations, but never clearly stated which clubs or whether Linder was legitimately affiliated with any of them. One particularly confusing element noted in some coverage was that Linder had patches and tattoos from clubs, plural, raising the question of whether he was simultaneously claiming affiliation with rival organizations, which would be unprecedented and inflammatory. The media confusion extended to the arrestees themselves. Initial arrest reports showed mugshots of 5 individuals charged in the case. One of these individuals, identified in reports as Jordan Lowe, appeared in photographs to be female, which created additional confusion. Traditional outlaw motorcycle clubs like the Warlocks have historically been male-only organizations, though some clubs have created affiliated women's clubs or support clubs. Whether Jordan Lowe was female-male or simply appeared ambiguous in the mugshot was never clarified in reporting. This detail might seem minor, but it speaks to the overall lack of clarity and fact-checking in coverage of the case. If Lowe was female and involved in the shooting, that would represent an evolution in club structure and participation in violence that would be newsworthy. Instead, the question was simply left hanging without answer. Another major source of confusion was the identification of which Warlocks organization was involved. The name Warlocks is used by multiple motorcycle clubs that are not affiliated with each other. There are at least 3 major organizations using the Warlocks name, including the Warlocks MC based in Florida, the Warlocks MC based in Pennsylvania, which is the larger and more established organization, and other regional clubs that have adopted the name. These organizations are distinct, have different histories, and are not chapters of the same national club. When news reports simply said Warlocks, without specifying which organization, it created confusion for anyone familiar with motorcycle club culture and made it impossible to understand the true nature of the conflict. Was this the Pennsylvania-based Warlocks, which has extensive history of conflict with rival clubs? Was it the Florida Warlocks? Was it an unaffiliated regional club using the name? The media never clarified, apparently either unaware of the distinction or unconcerned with providing accurate detail. This kind of confused reporting does real harm beyond just frustrating informed readers. It makes it impossible for communities to understand the actual threats they face. If the Pennsylvania Warlocks are involved in violent conflict with the Pagans, that suggests one level of risk that might spread to other areas where both clubs operate. If it's a smaller regional club, that suggests more localized conflict. If the victim wasn't actually affiliated with any major club, but was falsely claiming affiliation, that's a different story entirely, with different implications. The public deserves accurate information to assess risk and understand what's happening in their communities. But sloppy reporting filled with contradictions and gaps failed to provide that information. The prosecution strategy. Despite the confused media coverage, the prosecution's case against Michael Carno and his co-defendants proceeded with clarity and devastating effectiveness. The charges Carno faced went beyond simple murder, reflecting modern prosecutorial strategies for dealing with organized criminal groups. He was charged with murder, but also with attempted burglary while armed with a deadly weapon, attempted robbery while armed with a deadly weapon, and obstruction of justice. Each of these charges carried substantial prison time, but the most significant charge in terms of legal precedent was the charge of being a member of a criminal organization while committing these offenses. This charge represents an increasingly common prosecutorial tool that has profound implications for how law enforcement addresses motorcycle clubs and similar organizations. The charge of being a member of a criminal organization is distinct from more traditional gang enhancement penalties. It doesn't just increase the sentence for a crime committed by a gang member. It makes membership in the organization itself an element of the crime, essentially criminalizing association with groups designated as criminal organizations. In Carno's case, prosecutors argued that he was a member of the Warlocks Motorcycle Club, that the Warlocks constituted a criminal organization, and that the murder and related crimes were committed as part of his membership and activities within that organization. This approach allows prosecutors to introduce evidence about the club's broader criminal activities, not just the specific crime charged, to establish that the organization itself is criminal in nature. The legal foundation for these charges varies by state, but generally derives from gang statutes and organized crime laws. Indiana, where this case was prosecuted, has statutes that enhance penalties for crimes committed by criminal gang members and that specifically criminalize participation in criminal organizations. To prove someone is a member of a criminal organization, prosecutors must establish that the organization exists, that it has as one of its purposes the commission of crimes, and that the defendant was aware of this criminal purpose while participating in the organization. This can be proven through various evidence, including the organization's history of criminal activity, testimony from law enforcement gang experts, testimony from informants or cooperating witnesses, and the defendant's own statements and actions demonstrating knowledge of the organization's criminal nature. In motorcycle club cases, prosecutors have increasingly been successful in having clubs designated as criminal organizations. They introduce evidence of previous crimes committed by club members, often spanning years or decades. They present expert testimony from law enforcement officers who specialize in motorcycle club investigation, describing the club's structure, rules, and criminal activities. They use the club's own rhetoric, patches, and symbols against them, arguing that terms like 1%er demonstrate awareness of criminality and that club patches serve as identifiers for a criminal gang. Defense attorneys object to these tactics, arguing that they criminalize association and expression protected by the First Amendment, and that prosecuting organizations based on the actions of some members punishes people for associating with others rather than for their own criminal conduct. The constitutional tensions are real, but courts have generally sided with prosecutors, holding that the First Amendment doesn't protect criminal conspiracies and that motorcycle clubs engaging in systematic criminal activity can be prosecuted as organizations. The key distinction courts draw is between clubs that are primarily social organizations, with some members who commit crimes, versus organizations that are fundamentally criminal in nature, with crime as a core purpose. Prosecutors must prove the latter, showing that criminal activity isn't aberrant behavior by a few bad apples, but is central to the organization's identity and operations. In practice, this often means that larger, more established clubs with long histories are easier to prosecute as criminal organizations than newer or smaller clubs without extensive criminal records. For Michael Carno, being convicted of membership in a criminal organization while committing murder and related offenses added substantial time to his sentence, beyond what the murder charge alone would carry. The 90 to 130-year sentence he received reflects both the severity of murder and the enhancement from the criminal organization charge. This sentencing range essentially guarantees he will die in prison, removing him permanently from society. From a prosecutor's perspective, this outcome represents success not just in punishing one individual, but in dismantling criminal organizations by showing members that participation will result in extreme consequences. The prosecution's strategy in this case also reflected coordination between state and potentially federal authorities. While Carno was prosecuted in state court in Indiana, the investigation likely involved federal agencies, given the interstate elements, including Carno's trip to Philadelphia, and the potential involvement of multi-state motorcycle club organizations. Federal agencies, including the FBI and ATF, maintain specialized units focused on outlaw motorcycle clubs and often work with state and local law enforcement on investigations. The fact that prosecutors had detailed information about Carno's Philadelphia trip suggests surveillance or informant information that may have come from federal sources. This kind of interagency cooperation has become standard in major motorcycle club cases, pooling resources and expertise to build the strongest possible cases. The other 4 defendants arrested with Carno faced similar charges, though the outcomes of their cases received less media coverage than Carno's. Some may have accepted plea deals in exchange for cooperation or reduced charges. Others may have gone to trial separately. The lack of comprehensive reporting on these co-defendants' cases illustrates another media failure. Initial arrests get covered with sensational headlines, but final dispositions often go unreported, leaving the public without closure or understanding of how cases concluded. Did all 5 defendants receive substantial prison sentences? Did some cooperate and receive lighter sentences? Were any acquitted? These questions remain unanswered in public reporting, known only to those directly involved in the case. The cultural context and changing dynamics. To understand this case fully requires understanding the cultural context within motorcycle club communities and how that culture is evolving in ways that create both internal tensions and external dangers. The incident that led to Dustin Linder's death was, at its core, about respect and legitimacy within a subculture that places extraordinary importance on both. The entire violent confrontation occurred because Carno believed someone was wearing patches they hadn't earned, displaying symbols they had no right to display. To outsiders, this seems absurd, committing murder over patches and tattoos. But within motorcycle club culture, these symbols carry weight and meaning that mainstream society doesn't recognize or understand. Motorcycle club patches are earned through prospecting periods that can last months or years, during which individuals prove their loyalty, commitment, and worthiness of membership. Members endure testing, serve existing members, sometimes commit crimes to prove commitment, and demonstrate they can be trusted with the club's reputation and secrets. When someone finally receives their full patch in a ceremony surrounded by brothers who have vouched for them, it represents validation and belonging in a way few other things in life provide. The patch says to the world, "I belong here. These people accepted me. I earned this." It's why members will go to prison rather than surrender their patches. Why they'll fight to defend the patches. Why they view unauthorized wearing of patches as one of the most offensive acts imaginable. This cultural dynamic creates situations where violence over seemingly trivial matters becomes inevitable. If a member encounters someone wearing false patches and does nothing, he loses respect among his brothers for allowing disrespect to the club. If leadership learns that unauthorized individuals are wearing their patches without consequences, it makes the organization look weak and invites further disrespect. The culture creates a logic where violence becomes the only acceptable response to certain provocations, regardless of legal consequences. Members know that attacking someone over patches will likely result in arrest and imprisonment, but they do it anyway because maintaining respect within the subculture is more important than freedom in the broader society they've already rejected. However, motorcycle club culture is changing in ways that create confusion and conflict both internally and externally. Traditional rules that govern club behavior for decades are being questioned or violated by newer members and younger clubs. The old codes that said you don't involve civilians, you don't bring violence to people's homes, you keep conflicts between members and away from families, are breaking down. Recent incidents, including the killing of Lefty, a Pagan's member, at his home where his children heard the gunshots, have shocked even veterans of club culture. These violations of traditional boundaries suggest that newer members either don't know the old codes or don't care about maintaining them, leading to more indiscriminate violence that endangers innocence. Several factors are driving these cultural changes within motorcycle clubs. First, the massive prosecutions of the 1980s, 1990s, and 2000s removed multiple generations of traditional leadership who maintained the old codes. When entire club hierarchies were imprisoned through RICO prosecutions, younger members rose to leadership without the mentorship and cultural education that traditional structures provided. These younger leaders sometimes lack the wisdom and restraint of the old guard, being more impulsive and violent without the strategic thinking that asks whether violence will ultimately benefit or harm the club. Second, the changing criminal landscape has altered club dynamics. Traditional income sources, including drugs, prostitution, and protection rackets, face competition from other criminal organizations, including cartels, street gangs, and Eastern European networks. Motorcycle clubs no longer dominate criminal markets the way they once did, creating financial pressures and territorial conflicts that increase violence. Some clubs have attempted to go more legitimate, running legal businesses and distancing themselves from criminal activity, while others have doubled down on criminality and become more desperate and dangerous. Third, social media and modern technology have changed how clubs operate and are perceived. Younger members raised in the social media age want to document their club lives, posting photos and videos that older members view as security risks. This generational conflict over technology creates internal tensions. Meanwhile, the romanticization of motorcycle club culture in media, from Sons of Anarchy to YouTube channels dedicated to club culture, attracts people drawn to the image without understanding or respecting the reality. This creates situations where individuals claim club affiliation for status without earning it, like possibly occurred in the Linder case, which then triggers violent responses from legitimate members. Commentary from within the motorcycle community reflects frustration with these changing dynamics. Veterans of club culture express dismay at how traditional codes are breaking down. They argue that clubs need to evolve and stop fighting over territory and patches in an era where such conflicts just bring law enforcement attention without any real benefit. They point out that the criminal markets that once made territorial control valuable have largely disappeared, so fighting over territory is pointless. But these calls for change face resistance from traditionalists who view respect and territory as core elements of club identity that can't be abandoned without losing the essence of what makes motorcycle clubs meaningful. Content creators who cover motorcycle club culture find themselves in increasingly difficult positions. Many started covering clubs out of genuine interest in the lifestyle and wanted to present clubs in a positive light, countering mainstream media's exclusively negative portrayal. They've tried to highlight the brotherhood, charity work, and community aspects of club culture while downplaying criminal elements. However, the ongoing violence and particularly violations of traditional codes, like attacking families, have made this positive coverage increasingly difficult to justify. These creators report getting egg on their faces repeatedly when they defend clubs only to have another violent incident occur that makes them look naive. Some are shifting their coverage away from club content entirely, focusing instead on motorcycle culture more broadly without the criminal elements. Media failures and public confusion. The confused and contradictory coverage of the Indiana shooting case exemplifies broader failures in how media covers motorcycle club crime. These failures have multiple causes and serious consequences for public understanding and safety. The first and most obvious problem is that many journalists covering these stories lack basic knowledge about motorcycle club culture and structure. They don't understand the differences between clubs, the significance of patches and territories, or the internal dynamics that drive conflicts. This ignorance leads to superficial reporting that uses sensational language like biker gang shootout, without providing context that would help readers understand what actually happened and why. The lack of motorcycle club expertise among journalists creates situations like the Warlocks identification problem in the Indiana case. A journalist familiar with club culture would know that multiple organizations use the Warlocks name and would clarify which specific organization was involved. A journalist unfamiliar with this wouldn't know to ask the question, simply reporting Warlocks and moving on, leaving informed readers confused and misinformed. Similarly, the confusion about whether Linder was a Pagan or Warlocks member, or whether he was claiming false affiliation with both, represents a failure to ask basic questions and demand clear answers from law enforcement sources. These aren't difficult facts to verify, but they require knowing enough about the subject to recognize what's important and what's unclear. Second, law enforcement often provides incomplete or unclear information in press releases and public statements, and journalists often simply repeat this information without pressing for clarity or doing independent verification. In the Indiana case, prosecutor statements use vague language about patches and tattoos from clubs without specifying which clubs or whether the victim was legitimately affiliated. Journalists could have pressed prosecutors for specifics. Was Linder a Pagan member? Was he a Warlocks member? Was he claiming false affiliation with both? These are straightforward questions that prosecutors could answer, but apparently no journalists asked them, or if they did, they didn't report being stonewalled. This kind of passive journalism that simply transcribes official statements without questioning or verifying them fails the public's right to accurate information. Third, media coverage of motorcycle club cases often prioritizes initial sensational reports over follow-up that would provide complete understanding. Arrests get front-page coverage with dramatic headlines about gang shootouts, but convictions months or years later get brief. Mentions buried in the back pages. This creates distorted public perception where people remember the dramatic initial incident but don't learn the outcomes. In the Indiana case, the initial arrests in 2021 received substantial coverage, but the conviction and sentencing in early 2023 received much less attention, and the outcomes for the 4 co-defendants received almost none. Complete coverage would follow cases from incident through final disposition, but that requires sustained commitment and resources that many media outlets no longer provide. Fourth, the business model of modern media, particularly online media, incentivizes sensationalism over accuracy. Headlines that say biker gang shootout get more clicks than headlines that say motorcycle club dispute results in shooting. Stories filled with dramatic language about gangs and violence attract more readers than nuanced analysis of complex subcultures. This creates pressure on journalists to emphasize the sensational, even at the expense of accuracy. And it creates pressure on editors to accept incomplete or poorly verified stories because waiting for full verification might mean getting scooped by competitors. The result is journalism that informs poorly while appearing to inform, leaving readers with strong impressions but weak understanding. The consequences of these media failures extend beyond just confused readers. Incomplete and inaccurate reporting makes it harder for communities to assess actual risks and respond appropriately. If a major conflict between large motorcycle clubs is developing in a region, that's important for public safety and law enforcement resource allocation. But if reporting is so confused that people can't tell whether that's happening or whether it's a more localized incident, appropriate responses become impossible. Business owners, residents, and local officials need accurate information to make decisions, and confused journalism fails to provide that. Poor journalism also makes it harder to have productive conversations about motorcycle club policy and regulation. Should clubs be treated as criminal organizations subject to RICO prosecution? Should their patches be treated as gang identifiers that enhance criminal penalties? Should clubs have First Amendment protections for their expression and association? These are legitimate policy questions that society needs to debate, but productive debate requires accurate understanding of what motorcycle clubs actually are and do. When journalism provides confused and sensationalized coverage instead of accurate analysis, it makes informed debate impossible and pushes policy toward either excessive tolerance of criminal activity or excessive prosecution of association. For those within motorcycle club culture, The media failures create their own problems. Clubs already distrust mainstream media, viewing it as biased against them and focused only on negative aspects while ignoring positive contributions. Confused and inaccurate reporting confirms this distrust and makes clubs even less willing to cooperate with media, creating a vicious cycle where lack of cooperation leads to poor coverage, which leads to less cooperation. Some clubs have responded by creating their own media outlets and YouTube channels to present their perspectives, but these obviously lack objectivity and serve primarily as propaganda. What's needed is professional journalism that's both accurate and fair, neither reflexively hostile to clubs nor uncritically accepting of their self-presentation. The path forward requires changes from multiple parties. Journalists need to develop expertise in the subjects they cover, including understanding motorcycle club culture before writing about it. Media organizations need to invest in deeper, more thorough coverage, rather than just chasing clicks with sensational headlines. Law enforcement needs to provide more complete and accurate information in public statements, and needs to hold press conferences where journalists can ask questions rather than just releasing written statements. And the public needs to demand better, recognizing when coverage is confused or incomplete, and pushing back against sensationalism. The Indiana case will eventually fade from public memory, remembered if at all as just another motorcycle club shooting, but the lessons it teaches about media failures, cultural dynamics, and prosecutorial strategies remain relevant. As long as outlaw motorcycle clubs exist, there will be violent incidents stemming from their cultures of respect, territory, and honor. How society responds to this violence, how we understand and report it, and how we balance civil liberties against public safety will continue to challenge us. The Indiana case showed failures at multiple levels. A cultural dynamic that makes violence inevitable over matters that seem trivial, a prosecution that secured justice but raised civil liberties concerns, and media coverage that informed the public poorly despite extensive reporting. Learning from these failures and doing better next time is possible, but it requires recognizing the problems first. That recognition, at least, is something that can come from examining this confused and troubling case.